Welcome, everyone, to the Enneagram Global Summit. This is a pioneering session, a unique offering that has never happened before on the Enneagram Global Summit. And it's about a topic that is of great interest to any person that cares about our world today. It's about creating connection in a diverse global community. Our session is entitled Rebuilding the Bridges That Differences Broke. And our faculty is Dr. Deborah Egerton, founder and president of Trinity Transition Consultants. She is an internationally respected psychotherapist and executive coach who is often described as an unforgettable career thought leader, a diversity and inclusion practitioner, and an inspirational Enneagram teacher. She facilitates career growth and personal development with individuals and organizations by focusing her efforts on respecting the uniqueness of every individual and honoring the humanity in all of us. I'm so honored to be here with Deborah today. We've known each other for a few years, and last summer we connected very deeply in our hearts and souls about this pressing issue for our times, the need for human beings to find a common language, a common way of being together and building bridges that help them create positive, intentional contributions to our world. So, Deborah, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me with you today, Jessica. I'm excited to be talking about this topic. It's one that I think is long overdue in the Enneagram community and in our society. We need to be able to have genuine, authentic conversations and come up with ways to really work together and to be cultural allies, to work to create good, positive outcomes for all people and for us to come together in a global society to work together for good.
Well, Deborah, so many people that have worked with the Enneagram in different fields and different realms, and also people that are coming to the Enneagram new for the first time or discovering on this summit that the power of the Enneagram to help us understand how our differences can really, when you bring presence to them, be differentiations that actually help us communicate by understanding each other's differentiations in ways that are highly creative. I think that whole sensibility now being brought to the issue of diversity and global communication is just, if the Enneagram can do this, it's really where the rubber meets the road. So you doing this pioneering work is just a wonderful contribution, not only to the world, but to the Enneagram field itself. So thank you. And I'd like to begin by asking you a question. If you could explain to us how language is important and how a disconnect can occur between people based on communication.
Language is one of the many ways that we communicate, and we can be saying words with our mouths, and words can be coming out of our mouths, but our body language is saying something else. Our eyes are saying something entirely different. I look at language as the way that we communicate with one another, but we communicate or need to communicate with our whole selves in an authentic way. And sometimes the words that we use, they're not even our words. They're words that we've picked up from other people, from messages that we received from our parents or from our teachers or from our friends. And we pick up this language and we begin to use it. And sometimes the language itself can be very hurtful. I think about the word minorities. And minorities, while not intended to be a hurtful word, it still has a meaning that says less than. And the word minorities, if you happen to be a person of color or a person that is a quote unquote minority, it can be an uncomfortable, it's sort of what I call a sandpaper moment. You know, it just sort of pinches you just a little bit. I have come to realize that even the word white privilege creates a sandpaper moment, a pinch for many people who will say, while I may be white, and I grew up in a way where my skin was of a certain color that created people to look at me a certain way, but I certainly didn't grow up privileged. I didn't get any kind of privileges from being white. And so I've had to do a lot of explaining or talking about what white privilege, the terminology itself, has done to, in some ways, break a bridge because it angers some people on both sides. Someone who's a person of color will say, of course, if you're white, you have white privilege. But if you are white, you will sometimes say, I don't feel like I have privilege just because of the color of my skin. And that's a much deeper conversation that we may get into. But the reality is the language there is problematic. There are so many words that we use when it comes to differences between us that often create disconnects that will allow people to just go to a very negative place or want them to withdraw rather than engage or connect or go a little deeper into having the conversation and discussing what just happened now. What something was said and it changed the whole dynamic of our capacity to engage, and you're sort of backing away, and I think I want to back away too. And what was that would just happened that created that disconnect? And very often it can be language.
So have you found that the Enneagram, when you work with groups in diverse inclusion and diversity settings or leadership training settings, have you found that the Enneagram helps people develop a language that is easily unifying and compassionate and creative?
I have found that to be true, but it takes a lot of work. It takes people getting on the path or engaging the journey in a way where they're really going to stick with it and really learn the Enneagram, learn about themselves, and not use it as another tool to create a bunch of stereotypes. What happens, for instance, one of the tools that I use in doing diversity and inclusion work is the diversity wheel. And what I've done is I have placed the Enneagram at the core of the diversity wheel. And so when I teach the diversity wheel and the dimensions of our diversity and how they sort of spread out and what we sort of have access to or don't have access to based on the dimensions of our diversity, based on where we were born, who we were born to, what opportunities we may have had access to actually receive. If you start with the Enneagram in that place, the first thing that you can show people is that we're born with this sort of personality template, and then things begin to happen from there. And if you can really get people to understand that their Enneagram type is the very first thing to begin to look at when you start to look at dimensions of diversity, because based even upon your Enneagram type, you're going to look at diversity, at differences a little bit differently. You're going to be looking at it through 9 different lenses, and you're actually going to have 9 different solutions to some things, but also 9 different challenges in terms of the way that you approach differences. And that is very deep, very important work to do. So I never do the diversity wheel and the dimensions of diversity without beginning with the Enneagram.
So, Deborah, the way that you're talking about all of that, it's just really clear that this is so powerful. The Enneagram, just learning about the Enneagram itself is a diversity tool, whether somebody was even thinking about it that way or not. So have you found that people that have already studied the Enneagram have a little more natural opening for the diversity understanding about it?
I do feel with people who study the Enneagram, and particularly doing a lot of diversity and inclusion work, I kind of make it mandatory. I watch them begin to open up. One of the interesting things that will happen is that some things that people are assigning to different dimensions of diversity really have to do with the differences in terms of their Enneagram type. And that's very eye-opening for people. Some of the work that we do when we go deep into the Enneagram work is really recognizing that this is a package. This is an external package that you're looking at. And while I certainly can't get into all the things that I'll do in a diversity training, I will get people to just close their eyes and then become present and to look at someone in the room. Just look at some random person in the room and to look at that person for a good 10, 15 seconds. And then close their eyes again. And when I ask them to open their eyes, I say, now just imagine that that person that you're looking at could have been you. And the reality of this is a external package that we did not get to choose. And when you work with the Enneagram, in many ways, we're saying the same thing, except we're talking about something that's internal. And the pairing up of the understanding that our Enneagram type, our external packages, and many of the dimensions of our diversity that we're born with that are not things that we get to choose, really should help us to become more open about not labeling and judging one another, and certainly not finding different ways to work against each other, but rather to gain a deeper understanding of one another as individuals and to become more accepting.
Could you give an example of something that someone might be mistaking as a diversity issue that's actually a personality issue that the Enneagram would help them clarify?
Well, I'm a 1, and as a 1 with a 2 wing, I can say I'll use myself because I think it's a much more fair way to go down that road. There are times when my need to do the right thing, it's just very, very strong. It's just part of my hardwiring. And my work, my personal work, is the recognition that there is more than one way. not so much to live in the either or, but the both and of the reality of life. As an Enneagram 1, if people are not doing something the way that I think it should be done, I might look at certain aspects of their diversity and just think that they're being stubborn. I could be looking at it from the standpoint of gender. I could be looking at it from the standpoint of race. I could look at it from the standpoint of even socioeconomic class. Many of those things are ways that you can look at someone and begin to label and actually assign blame or guilt based upon the dimension of their diversity. Because as a 1, if they're not doing the right thing, then sometimes you're wondering why. You're asking yourself the question, why would this person who has a lot of money not be more generous? Why would they not do that? Well, as an Enneagram 1, why am I judging? Why am I even asking that question? What's that about? So to move away from even doing that, from moving into that judgmental or that self-righteous space, opens up the opportunity to connect in a very different way to people that I might have judged. And let's face it, when we start judging based on what we sometimes see. And if we want to make a connection, we can make a lot of connections that are wrong and hurtful, but not necessarily will we see that some of what we're doing has to do with our own Enneagram stuff.
Beautiful. So can you tell us then, what are some of the ways that people can use the Enneagram to become more like cultural allies?
I think the Enneagram is absolutely the cultural ally tool because, if I will say this, I make people laugh when I say this because I'm afraid I quote scripture like a Catholic. Okay, so I always know the story, but never the exact correct words. But the one about why are you looking at the splinter in somebody else's eye when you've got a plank in your own? When you are doing the Enneagram work and you are looking at your own stuff or just observing your own behaviors, your own judgments, the inner critic or the voice in the head that's actually telling you so much about what's wrong with someone else. The Enneagram work allows you to recognize how often you do that. And I've often said that when people start doing that, and I have watched this happen in diversity work, my words are, you do it long enough and you start to feel like you're literally slapping yourself. And you get a little bit sick. You get a little bit disgusted with yourself in some ways, just that you're making these judgments and that you are looking at other people in what we call a less than sort of way. And when I talk about myself in terms of the work that I do, honoring the humanity in us all, if we're not able to do that, if we're not able to do that in ourselves, then we can't do it in other people. And so when people begin to understand and really work with the Enneagram and begin to honor presence, begin to honor who they are and who they are created to be and are freed up from all of these isms, then when you look at someone else, you look at them through different eyes. You look at them with more innocence and more purity and less judgment and less It just it softens the edges.
Deborah, you gave a wonderful example about yourself and how working with your own type opens you up to a new conversation in terms of communication and building bridges, right? In diversity work. I'm wondering if you might just give like a brief example for each type. Like, what is something that, each type might be looking at in terms of what's getting in the way of building those bridges from their perspective?
Well, every type has their own struggle, and if we go around the Enneagram spectrum, and we look at each type. If I look at starting with the eights, for an eight, never wanting to be vulnerable, wanting to more or less be in control to keep themselves safe, and to keep their people safe. That could get in the way. That could be something that the not wanting to enter any kind of a space or circumstance where differences might make them more vulnerable, or might not keep them safe or anyone that they consider to be under their protection. So differences could play a huge part in the role of how an eight might approach differences. When you look at the nine, conflict, differences, conflict. I may say something, you may say something. It may create a conflict. I don't like conflict. And so maybe if my life is a little more monolithic, I can avoid more the conflict. I can kind of stay away from these conversations that I really don't want to have anyway. If you look at the one, I've already explained that in terms of, the judgment, why aren't you doing it the way I would do it? That can very much get in the way. With twos, wanting to be helpful, but perhaps that help isn't received as the two would want it to be received. That could get in the way in terms of differences. The threes, wanting to be achievers, and how might someone be getting in the way of their achievement? Or might that person not seem to be quite on board with success and doing things the way maybe a three would like to do it in order to, reach the finish line? With fours and the uniqueness of the four, the differences sometimes are, don't try to put me in the box. Why are you trying to force me to do something that just doesn't suit me well? And that could be a very uncomfortable place for a four to be. And what's on the other side? What's the difference on the other side that they may be looking at, that they might assign something to, other than understanding that it might be about their own Enneagram type. So the five, wanting competence, wanting to have knowledge, and let's say someone disrespects the work that a five has done. What's on the other side? Who's disrespecting that work? Who is not really giving the five the credit that they may feel that they're due, or the recognition for really coming up with something that is well researched, but rather than accepting that, it's just kind of pushing them for a deadline, pushing them to reach that deadline. That could get in the way of the feelings that a five might have about the person who's applying that kind of pressure. The six, who's looking for answers and looking to get it right, and wants to ask the questions just to get it right, to be sure that they're doing what they are supposed to be doing. They want to get that assignment right. Who's that person on the other side that's so annoyed with their questions? And so that might get in the way of the 6 feeling like they're being disrespected or not understood because someone is resisting or pushing them away and saying, please, you and these questions, get out of my way. The 7 who wants their freedom and they want to be happy and joyful, who's raining on their parade? And the people that are raining on their parade and not allowing for the 7 to have that sort of freedom of movement that can often be so important to them, that's sort of trying to keep them in a box that they're not going to stay in. When they look up on the other side of that, that difference that they see might be one of the things that challenges the 7. So just like I said, going around the spectrum that way, if we just all think about the struggles or challenges that we have in certain areas, our kind of fatal flaws, our blind spots, and who's poking at that? Who's poking at that little hurtful part that we're trying to heal and we're trying to reconcile and we're trying to reconnect in a good way within ourselves? Who is on the other side of really creating or triggering the things that sometimes we fear most or that hurt us most? And so what I say to people when I'm teaching them the Enneagram and with diversity is to pay attention to that. Pay attention to what just got poked. What just got poked for me? And what am I assigning to that?
So you just gave us a wonderful journey through some of the obstacles or the pinches that people might have in a kind of observing of their own self-observation. So you work with groups, and the whole theme there is inclusion and diversity. You must notice that people start to work better together through the training. And I'm wondering if it becomes apparent to the group at that point that different types have different gifts to that process. And maybe you might take us around, like what's in the diversity work in particular. What do you think are some of the strong suits of each point in terms of helping with that work?
When I work with the groups, and once we get past the introductory work, and then people are really sent off to begin to go deeper into their own type, every time they come back together, and you can see the growth that is based on the reality that they're beginning to see themselves a little bit better in terms of how they show up in the world. And for each type, that will manifest differently. Once again, starting with the 8s, the sort of fear of being around or being in a space that feels uncomfortable for the 8. Now, it's a very interesting thing because in some ways, I see many 8s that seem to not be uncomfortable approaching anyone about anything. But then I've also seen, based on even subtypes, some 8s that they'll just leave something be. But what I've noticed as we do this work and we're doing it focused on diversity, the 8s develop a level of comfort of initiating the conversations that sometimes they might not have initiated it with a person of color, but then as the group works over time, they will. Or they'll introduce it, somewhere within the hierarchy that they had kind of given up on even talking to that person because they had sort of boxed them as someone that was really not going to give them what they needed, or asking the question because they had asked it in the past, it didn't yield the result the 8 wanted. And so I notice a flexibility that begins to happen with the 8. With the 9, it's not being as tentative, and instead of leaning back and away and waiting to see what's going to happen, the 9 begins to lean in a little more, and with a little more curiosity and presence and groundedness, about engaging with the group. Now, as we know, 9s can be magnificent mediators anyway, because they're feeling the vibe of the people in the room, but they just don't like to be the ones that create a conflict. I have seen, and I can't cite the specific instance for obvious reason, but I have seen several 9s be the one that actually began the conflict that needed to happen because they weren't dancing around it anymore. They just, it went across gender, it went across race. In one case, it went across sexual orientation, but they wanted to understand. And this is what is happening when people are going deeper into their Enneagram work and become less fearful of the diversity work. They want to understand. So the questions are coming from a different space. The 1s, when they're ready to engage because they've gone deeper, become less self-righteous. It's a little less preachy-teachy. It's a little more listening and not so much putting it out there themselves. But one of the behaviors I've noticed is that 1s will actually begin to sort of take notes on what's going on and what people are saying, almost like they want to look at it again later to really figure it out. And I will say this, for the ones that are doing the Enneagram work in conjunction with the diversity work, sometimes I find that they experience a lot of pain because there is this feeling that I thought I was doing the right thing, and now the stories that I'm hearing don't line up with what I believe to be true. And so there's less resistance and more taking in of the information. With the 2s, who often want to be helpful in the situation, the 2s, once again, also become a little more silent, and there's a little more listening and wanting to understand, and at the same time asking questions about how would this be taken? If I were to say this, how would you take that? Because the 2 then wants to know, well, how can I be helpful if I have not been helpful when that's what I thought I was doing? The 3s, sometimes I see a sense of wonder and fascination about the whole thing. Sometimes that wonder and fascination will manifest as, I don't understand why this has to be such an issue, but since it is, let me figure out how to get it right. And so the 3s will engage with a lot of questions, and many of the questions for the first time are of a more personal nature coming from the 3, which I have always found to be very, very interesting. The 3 moving towards achieving and being successful, it's not so much just how can I be successful, but then there's this, well, how can I work well with this team of different people? And the questions are coming from that space. With the 4s, and this always makes me smile. I've had several 4s to say that the Enneagram work made them very happy because it just allowed them to understand that they are who they are, and that's cool. And so the work with diversity and fours sort of brightens fours up in a way where they like the uniqueness of being an individual, and the four will actually speak up and kind of support the different positions around differences. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of communication that comes from four saying, you know, we should all be able to be who we are and not have to check who we are at the front door. With the fives, much like with the ones, there's some very intense listening and questions that will get asked that are based on the historical basis of how did this all get started? How did this begin? Where did we go wrong? Where are we going with it in the future? So there's a lot of really good questions that come into the mix with our fives. The sixes seem to be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when the diversity work gets deeper. They're uncomfortable for a time until we reach a point in the conversation where the sixes are comfortable with some of the content that's being presented. So there's some skepticism there, but once, particularly when we have a diverse group, once the stories are gathered from different people, then it begins to crystallize and make much more sense to the six. And I find that sixes will come back with a lot of questions over and over again about different things because once again, they're going deeper. They're going down into the layers. And the sevens, if I haven't run them all out of the room by the time we've gone through this, and they're not angry with me for, not making it fun, the sevens will actually give some amazing sort of examples of circumstances and situations in their lives where it never occurred to them that this would be a problem. It never occurred to them that someone might perceive their actions to be hurtful or discriminatory, or that they were in any way doing anything but bringing, kind of joy and a positive light to the group. So with each Enneagram type, there's some different things, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the things that bubble up. But those are some of the experiences that I've had.
Wonderful. Of course, those are just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm wondering, Deborah, as you sit here, can you think of a particular story that has happened in one of your trainings that was maybe one of the more powerful examples to you of something that can happen by people using the Enneagram with the diversity training?
I actually can. When I do that, I prefer to put myself in the story rather than to tell someone else's story. I always say that, when you share information, unless you share it with permission, it's gossip. So I don't believe in gossip. But I do remember a very, very powerful training that I was doing with a group of nuns. And they were actually having a bit of a struggle with the novitiates who were coming into the convent. And most of these new young women coming in were from Central America, South America, different parts of the world, Philippines. And some of the old guard was struggling a bit with that. And we were doing Enneagram work and diversity work at the same time. And I believe that what the Enneagram does for all of us is that it makes us real. It allows us to connect to one another on a much deeper level. And so we were telling stories about a time when we felt disrespected, or a time when we saw someone else disrespecting someone and what was done about it. And as we were going around the circle telling stories, um, some of the nuns actually were struggling to come up with a story of the time that they felt disrespected. And many of them could tell stories of times when they saw someone else disrespected and what did they do about it, and what was the dimension of diversity in question. And since so many of them were struggling that particular day, I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to have to go story myself so that I can kind of get them going here and understand where we're going with this. And I went back to a time of when my youngest, my now oldest son, but when he was a baby, of being out in a playground with him. And he was playing with another little boy, and the father, or I believe grandfather of the little boy, came over and he grabbed his child or grandchild away from my son. And he said, "Don't ever let me catch you playing with a N word again. Don't ever let me see you doing that again." And they were toddlers. They were maybe 18 months old. And I was, shocked and horrified. And of course, my son didn't have any idea of what was happening. But I ran over and I picked him up and I just held him. And I started to sob. And I thought, oh my God, is this what your world, your life is going to be like? And Enneagram 1, this is so not right. This is so not right. Something has to be done in this world about this. And as I shared this story with the nuns, they started coming in closer to me. And they all gathered around me, holding me. And they all started to cry. And by then, of course, I was crying. And I said, this is why I do what I do. I said, because it's the right thing to do for people to understand that we all have to be in this together. We have to be connected and care. If one person cares about someone else's child as much as I care about my child, and it's made a difference. And it was the sudden moment. They got it. They got it. And they got it in terms of beginning to understand and began talking about what got in the way for each one of them from even being able to see the disrespect that was sometimes out there in the world. And so, because the Enneagram takes us to such a powerful personal place, I believe it opens us up and it allows us to move from, and I'll just say this, tolerance to acceptance. I'm not going to say that tolerance is a bad thing, but I think many of us got stuck at tolerance. And when I hear the word tolerance, I hear my mother's voice saying, "Deborah, I will not tolerate that behavior, not one more second." So when you're being tolerant or live and let live, that's kind of one thing. But when you're embracing or accepting or even just learning and trying to go deeper, which the Enneagram allows us to do, that's when we reach that point of becoming cultural allies. Because to really be a cultural ally and to work with the Enneagram, you have a tool to help you. You have a blueprint, a map that helps you to understand people and yourself at a deeper level, and then you can become an ally for good.
What an inspiring story. So I'm wondering if in this last couple of minutes, Deborah, you could tell us about your project, The Platinum Connection.
So it was put on my heart, actually. I have to laugh about this. 9 years ago, was even before President Obama was elected. And I started writing about whether or not our nation would rise to the occasion of, with the whole world watching, becoming more accepting and more inclusive, and we would really begin to show ourselves and the world that we wanted to move forward in a different kind of way, and we wanted to move forward together. And I started writing about it, and then as I started to see things happening, my heart started to break a little bit, and it was like I couldn't write from a broken-hearted place. I have to write from a place of love, because I think we all need to be encouraged right now. There are enough sad stories and hurtful stories out there that are heartbreaking, that they can actually lead to a bit of a paralysis, a bit of what can I do? And so what I'm trying to do is really make it easy for people to do something. The building of bridges and not walls is very important to me, because we face more than a black-white issue. We have a black-white issue in the United States of America, but no matter where you go, there is an issue. There is a historical issue that has existed since the beginning of time, and people struggle with that, and they struggle with making the connection or getting past that particular difference and being able to connect. And I also want to say, when I talk about differences, I'm not just talking about the dimensions of diversity, but I'm also talking about differences that have broken relationships, that have broken families, that have broken people to the point where they don't think that there's any bridge back. And so the Platinum Connection is a curriculum that I've developed that actually allows people to become platinum ambassadors. And I've asked different people, wonderful people, of course, in the Enneagram community, if they would be willing to be platinum ambassadors. What I am doing is I'm offering to them the different tools that I have studied around conflict resolution, around healing, and mainly the Enneagram, and working with each type in terms of how do we actually repair a disconnect. And sometimes these disconnects started over something that is so very small, and yet it turned into a huge gulf. It's like trying to cross the Grand Canyon. And the Platinum Ambassadors will be taught how to actually facilitate conversations, how to have local dialogue with people who want to be part of the Platinum Connection. And my vision is seeing this as a band of platinum that circles the earth, something that is strong but precious, something that could hold the most precious jewel, and that is humanity, and hold it together and allow us to be connected to one another, to talk to one another, to have healing conversations. For people that don't know how to do that, to learn how to do that. For people who don't know how to take that first step, to help them to make that first step. And so it is starting to rebuild these bridges that differences broke. And for each person, part of becoming a Platinum Ambassador is to look into your own heart and find, what's that bridge that I need to rebuild? And then we begin the work together.
Deborah, can you tell people how to get a hold of you if they'd like to get connected to your work?
Yeah, yes. If people want to connect with me, I have a website. We have an actual section there for people who want to connect with us to become part of the Platinum Connection. And what will happen once you reach out to me and we have your name, then we will contact you. I'm looking to bring communities together to identify where there is an ambassador and where people can go in order to be able to really access training. The ambassadors will be certified to be able to conduct the trainings and to really put people to work in their own lives, in their own communities. And I have to kind of quote Mother Teresa on this. You've got to begin with your own family. You really do. So one of the requirements of doing this is to really look at a bridge that is broken. And did it break? And my heart breaks when I think about the people who have shunned their children because of an interracial or because of a religious differences in marriages, who have never seen those grandchildren or refused to see those grandchildren. Love will bring them back together, but that person has to be open to that. And often that person feels like they might be, but they don't even know how to get there. So all of the differences that we have allowed to tear us apart, to come together and to try to heal as many hurts as we can, and to allow love to be a much stronger motivator than it has ever been in the past.
Beautiful. So the Enneagram, we're shown and we experience time and time again, helps us see the ways that we have separated ourselves from love and from wisdom and from presence. And now you are taking that very powerful personal growth and spiritual development tool and applying it to the real spiritual understanding, and that in any way that we are separated from each other, we are separated from love, wisdom, and presence. And so thank you so much, Deborah, for this incredibly pioneering and inspiring work. I truly appreciate you being here today and look forward to working with you as an ambassador in the world to come.
Thank you for having me, Jessica. And it is the true desire of my heart that we, as a community, the Enneagram community, can do more to heal and to help, to bring love into the world. All anyone has to think about is a parent actually reclaiming, re-embracing their child who they have pushed away based on a difference, or grandparents going to see that grandchild that they didn't want to see because they weren't happy about the union because the union involved differences, or the colleague, the coworker that actually gets a promotion because you were the cultural ally that said, there's something not right here. Everyone keeps advancing, but this person doesn't, and their work is phenomenal. We really need to address this. It's developing the courage to speak the truth with love and to support one another wherever and whenever and however we can. And I think if we can bring the Enneagram mainstream in that way, we will be doing what we were intended to do. Thank you.